On a quiet Saturday afternoon, February 6, 1982, 2-year-old Tara Burke vanished from a parking lot in Concord, California, while her parents were just steps away inside a nearby store. What started as an ordinary family errand quickly turned into one of the most heartbreaking child abduction cases the city had ever seen. That day, Steve and Elizabeth Burke left their home in West Pittsburgh and made the short drive to Concord with their two youngest children, 9-year-old Jeremy and little Tara. The family had planned a quick stop at an auto parts store on Clayton Road to exchange a part for their van. Expecting to be gone for just a few minutes, Steve parked near the entrance, turned off the engine, and handed a simple but important task to Jeremy. Keep an eye on your sister, Tara. Sitting in her child's seat behind him, was playing quietly, completely unaware of the danger about to unfold. Steve and Elizabeth stepped into the store at around 4 p.m., thinking it would be a quick visit. According to the police report filed later that evening, only a few minutes passed before a young man approached the vehicle. Jeremy remembered the man as looking to be in his early 20s, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap that shadowed his face. He seemed calm, not hurried or aggressive. He tapped on the window and said, "Your mom wants you inside." It was a believable line. Jeremy, not sensing anything wrong, opened the side door. That's when the man reached in, unbuckled Tara, and scooped her into his arms. Without saying another word, he took off running. Jeremy shouted and immediately tried to follow, but the man moved fast, disappearing across the parking lot before Jeremy could even make it out of the van. A few bystanders later reported seeing a man carrying a small child toward a nearby apartment complex. But by the time anyone realized what was happening, he was already gone. When Steve and Elizabeth came back out, the van door was wide open and Tara was missing. Panic set in instantly. At approximately 4:35 p.m., a 911 call was placed. Officers from the Concord Police Department responded within minutes. They followed the department's standard protocol for missing children. The area around the store was sealed off, and officers began canvassing for witnesses. A description of both the missing toddler and the unknown suspect was immediately dispatched to patrol cars throughout the region. Officers searched behind the store, checked nearby alleys, dumpsters, and vehicles, but found nothing. One person mentioned seeing a brown sedan speeding away from the lot, but the sighting couldn't be confirmed just 2 minutes after the call at 4:37 p.m. The case was turned over to Sergeant Richard Dick Gordy of the department's Juvenile Bureau. Gordy, a well-respected 12-year veteran, arrived on scene shortly after 5 p.m. after talking with Steve, Elizabeth, and young Jeremy. He quickly contacted the FBI in California's Missing and Exploited Children Unit for backup. Police collected a recent photo of Tara, one taken just weeks earlier during the holidays, and rushed to duplicate it for immediate distribution. Roadblocks were quickly established on major highways leading out of Concord, but by nightfall, neither the suspect nor any vehicle fitting the vague descriptions had been located. Within hours, Tara's disappearance was all over local radio and television. Emergency bulletins described her as a Caucasian female, 2 years and 9 months old, around 30 pounds, with blonde hair and brown eyes. She had last been seen wearing a pink sweater and white overalls. As word spread, the community stepped in. Volunteers showed up without being asked. Groups of residents, police officers, and search dogs combed through parking lots, drainage ditches, and nearby open fields. Helicopters equipped with infrared lights flew overhead in organized patterns through the night. The next morning, detectives brought Jeremy in for another interview, this time with a child psychologist present. He quietly repeated what he had heard the man say, "Your mom wants you inside." He said the man wasn't threatening, just calm, almost like he belonged there. A composite sketch was drawn based on Jeremy's recollection and quickly released to the media. But the image was too generic to lead to any clear suspect. Over the next 3 days, the police hotline received more than 50 calls from across the Bay Area. Many claimed to have seen a child who looked like Tara in parks, shopping centers, or even at gas stations. Every report was checked, and each one ruled out. No ransom notes arrived. No suspicious family ties, custody battles, or financial motives were uncovered. In the days following Tara Burke's disappearance, Concord changed. What was once a quiet suburban community had now become the center of a massive emotional search effort. Police officers from surrounding counties, including Contra Costa deputies and the California Highway Patrol, joined forces with Concord's local units. Their mission was as clear as it was overwhelming. Find a little girl who vanished in the middle of the day from a crowded commercial street with no trace left behind. By Sunday morning, Tara's case had gone far beyond city lines. Her face, captured in that holiday photo, now appeared on the front pages of local newspapers. Next to the words, "Missing Child," flyers were printed by the hundreds and passed out at gas stations. Schools, grocery stores, and shopping centers all across the region. Search teams gathered at a local community center, armed with flashlights, radios, and hand-marked grid maps. Helicopters scoured fields, creeks, and wooded areas. Every abandoned building within a 5-mile radius was checked, one by one. But despite the urgency and manpower, the results were devastating. No clothing, no toys, no physical signs of struggle. It was as if she had simply disappeared. Witness reports varied. Some said they saw a man with a child, but the descriptions were inconsistent, from the color of his clothes to which direction he was heading. And just like that, Tara Burke was gone. Another witness thought she saw a brown sedan speeding away from the parking lot, but she couldn't catch the license plate. It was just a blur. Another possible clue, but once again, it led nowhere. By the end of that first week, over 1,000 man-hours had already been poured into the investigation. Despite the urgency, the search had produced little more than scattered sightings, uncertain memories, and speculation. Inside the Concord Police Department, Sergeant Richard Dick Gordy led the investigation from the Juvenile Bureau. His small office had become the central hub of the search. Its walls were papered with maps of the city, detailed timelines, and photographs of every possible lead. But at the heart of it all was one photo, a school portrait of Tara Burke. It was pinned above his desk, always in view. Gordy kept a folded copy of that same picture in the breast pocket of his shirt, worn from being opened and studied too many times. Each morning, before he reviewed the overnight tip reports, he would glance at the photo. For Gordy, the case became more than just another file. It became personal. He'd seen enough missing child cases over his years in law enforcement to know how these stories often ended. But there was something about Tara's case, her age, the circumstances, the silence that followed, that didn't sit right with him. Tara was just 2.5 years old. She was far too young to run away, too small to fight back. That fact, more than anything, haunted Gordy. It made her disappearance harder to accept, harder to let go. Years later, in a series of interviews, Gordy would explain what kept him going in those first few weeks. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't new leads. It was the simple belief that Tara might still be out there, alive. "I didn't have proof," he said, "but until you find a body, you keep hoping." As February faded into March, the investigation widened. The California Department of Justice added Tara's case to the state's missing children database. Her photograph was sent to airports and border crossings throughout the region. The FBI stepped in to assist. Though their involvement was limited, there was no confirmation. Tara had been taken across state lines. Tips continued to arrive, hopeful, confusing, and ultimately heartbreaking. Someone thought they saw her in a supermarket in Fresno. Another caller reported a child matching her description at a rest stop near Sacramento. Officers followed up every single time, but each lead eventually unraveled. The date didn't match, or the child didn't, or the vehicle turned out to be unrelated. Meanwhile, the Burkes were thrust into the spotlight. Their home became a focus for media coverage. Reporters camped outside, offering updates, speculating, hoping for statements. Elizabeth Burke made a quiet, heartfelt public plea. Please bring her home. She's all we have. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Steve Burke, more reserved, stayed out of the spotlight, working closely with detectives and supporting the investigation as best he could. Neighbors and friends rallied around the family. They tied yellow ribbons to trees in the Burke's yard and held candlelight vigils in local parks. What had started as a family's nightmare had grown into a shared tragedy. When the entire community felt deeply, inside police headquarters, the urgency that marked the early days began to slow. Detectives re-examined every detail: timelines, statements, security footage, and maps of the abduction site. They re-interviewed employees at the auto parts store. They checked in with known offenders in the area. Nothing clicked. Still, Sergeant Gordy refused to let the case fade. While other files stacked up, he kept Tara's open, always within reach. He went through pawn shop logs, motel registries, and DMV records, scanning for any trace of a man traveling with a small child. He even called local hospitals, asking if any unidentified young girls had been brought in under odd circumstances. Each time, the answer was the same: nothing. The nights became the hardest part. Gordy often stayed long after his shift had ended, surrounded by silence and the dim glow of the fluorescent lights above his desk. The phone line for tips would ring at all hours, sometimes with genuine concern, often with vague sightings that led nowhere. I saw her in Oakland, one caller would say. A man with a little girl near the pier. Every report was written down. Every tip logged and followed up. But one after another, the leads collapsed. Weeks passed. The posters that once stood out on telephone poles and storefronts began to fade, curling in the rain. The once busy tip line rang less and less. Within the department, newer cases pulled resources away. For many, Tara Burke became another unresolved disappearance, a heartbreaking mystery among many, but not for Gordy. He kept the photo pinned above his desk, the file always open. In his mind, someone still knew something. Someone had the answer. And even if Tara herself couldn't speak anymore, he believed the truth could still be found. Long after the station emptied for the night, he stayed behind, quietly flipping through contact sheets, notes, and timelines, hoping the next call would be the one that changed everything. Then, nearly 10 months after Tara's disappearance, on the cold morning of December 18, 1982, a report came in from San Francisco. It reached Gordy's desk before noon that an 11-year-old boy had walked into a local police station just after dawn. He looked underweight, bruised, and frightened, wearing clothes that clearly didn't belong to him. He told the officer on duty that he had just escaped from a man who had been keeping him. Locked inside a van. His first words were recorded in the station's incident log. He keeps me in a van. There's another kid in there too. The boy identified himself as Mac, short for Mackenzie. In his first interview, he explained that he had been staying with a man who called himself Tree. He didn't know his real name. What he did know was that Tree was tall, heavy-set, had messy hair and a beard, and lived mostly out of an old silver-gray Dodge van that never stayed parked in the same spot for long. Max said the man constantly moved locations, sleeping in industrial zones or under freeway overpasses, and always kept the windows covered with cardboard or fabric from the inside. At first, the officers were cautious. In San Francisco at that time, runaway children weren't unusual. Many had complicated stories about where they'd been and who they'd been with. But something about Mac's story was different. His memory was unusually sharp. His details were consistent. He described the smell inside the van, a strong mix of oil mold and sweat, and the interior setup, a mattress stretched across the floor, cluttered spaces filled with dirty clothes, and a small ceiling vent that he claimed he used to escape. Even more alarming, Mac said that there were actually two men living in the van, the older one, who went by Tree Frog, and a younger one, around 17 years old. Mac told the officers that Tree had picked him up several months earlier near a bus stop, offering him food and money in exchange for helping watch a little kid. When pressed on what he meant by a little kid, Mac said it was a very young child, possibly a girl, though he wasn't entirely sure, with short hair, who never talked and was always kept inside the van. The child didn't play, didn't speak, and barely moved. She was always there, hidden, quiet. The interview lasted more than 2 hours. While speaking with him, officers documented multiple injuries. Mac had bruises across his shoulders and back that appeared consistent with being struck by a hose or similar object. He said that's exactly what the man used to hit him. Medical staff from a nearby clinic examined the marks and confirmed they were recent and showed signs of repeated trauma, because Mac had specifically mentioned another child possibly still being held. The San Francisco Police Department acted quickly. They issued an immediate alert to all units in the area and began a focused search for any vans matching the description. A silver or gray Dodge model from the late 1970s, with visible damage on the side panel and rear windows heavily tinted or covered. By early afternoon, a teletype message arrived at the Concord Police Department requesting assistance. The description of the van, and more importantly, the details about the silent, short-haired child struck a nerve with Sergeant Gordy. When he read the report, Gordy reportedly fell silent mid-sentence. The similarities to Tara Burke were impossible to ignore. Within the hour, Gordy was on the phone with San Francisco investigators. That same evening, detectives from both departments met to exchange information. Gordy brought Tara's photo, the full missing person report, and a breakdown of everything known about the day she vanished. San Francisco detectives walked him through Mac's statement, sharing every relevant detail. Mac had told them that Tree often parked in industrial areas south of Market Street, sometimes near Potrero Hill or along the edge of the waterfront. He'd also mentioned that the older man talked about starting a family, and that the younger man sometimes referred to him by name, Luis. That one name was the break they needed. Investigators ran the name Luis through local arrest records. It wasn't long before they found a match. Luis Johnson, 33 years old. Known on the streets as Tree Frog, he had previous arrests for indecent exposure and narcotics possession. He had no fixed address and was believed to be living out of his van. Surveillance photos from past arrests confirmed the match. He looked exactly like the man Mac had described. Just after midnight, officers from the San Francisco Police Department tracked down a van registered to Johnson, a 1976 Dodge Tradesman, silver gray, with a dented left panel. The van had recently been marked as abandoned in a lot near an old industrial site off Army Street, now known as Cesar Chavez Street. A patrol unit was sent to verify. When they arrived, the van was still there. Its windows were covered tightly with cardboard and duct tape. The engine was cold. It hadn't been moved in hours. But through a small tear and one of the window coverings, officers noticed a faint light flickering from inside. They called for backup. Units surrounded the vehicle and used a loudspeaker to call out commands. There was no response. After several warnings and no movement inside, officers forced the side door open. What they found was haunting. The interior of the van was dark, musty, and chaotic. Trash and food containers were strewn across the floor. A thin mattress sat in the back. Lying on top was a small child, a little girl with short, unevenly cut hair wrapped tightly in a blanket. She wasn't speaking, but she was breathing. Nearby, in a separate vehicle, officers found and arrested Louise Johnson without resistance. The younger accomplice, identified as Alex Cabarra, age 17, was also detained at the scene. The girl was taken immediately to the Children's Home Society in San Francisco. She did not speak. She did not respond to questions. She appeared weak, malnourished, and confused. Her estimated age was around 3. Because of her fragile condition and lack of verbal communication, police couldn't immediately confirm who she was. Late that night, technicians compared her fingerprints with prints that had been collected from toys and furniture inside the Burke family home earlier that year. The results were conclusive. The child found in that van was Tara Burke. When Sergeant Gordy got the call, confirming her identity, he didn't say a word. He left his office quietly and drove to San Francisco. Witnesses later recalled that he arrived just before sunrise, holding the same photo he had carried in his shirt pocket for nearly a year. For 10 long months, Tara had been missing, her fate unknown. No clues, no sightings, no demands. And then, in the most unexpected way, the answer came not from forensics, not from surveillance, but from the bravery of another child who escaped and found the strength to speak up. The case was no longer just about a disappearance. It had become something deeper, an investigation into what had happened inside that van and how 2 children survived it on the night of December 18, 1982, nearly 10 months after Tara Burke vanished. San Francisco police acted on a critical lead provided by 11-year-old Mac. His testimony had offered a clear picture of the suspect, a man who went by the nickname Tree, Frog, and the disturbing details of a gray Dodge van with covered windows and signs of prolonged use. Everything Mac had said, the smells, the sounds, even the way the van was hidden near freight trains and old buildings, helped narrow the search. Just before midnight, around 11:45 p.m., patrol officers spotted a vehicle matching the exact description parked near an abandoned warehouse district off Army Street, in the southeastern part of the city. The setting aligned with Mac's account, an industrial zone where few people ventured after dark. The van, a silver-gray Dodge Tradesman, showed heavy damage on its left side. Its rear windows were obscured with cardboard and duct tape, making it impossible to see inside. Officers approached with caution. The vehicle felt cold to the touch, indicating it hadn't been moved for several hours. But through a tiny tear in the window covering, they noticed a faint flicker of light coming from inside, just enough to confirm there was movement. Backup was called immediately. Officers quietly surrounded the van, taking positions in case there were multiple occupants or potential danger. Using a loudspeaker, they ordered anyone inside to come out with their hands visible. There was no reply. The van remained still and silent. Following procedure for a potential hostage situation, officers formed an entry team and forced open the side door. What came out first was the air, thick and stale, carrying the heavy scent of unwashed clothes, rotting food, and damp metal. Inside, the space was cramped, barely enough room for 2 adults to stand upright. Flashlights revealed an interior full of trash, crushed food containers, discarded clothing, beer cans, and other debris piled across the floor. Children's clothing was scattered among the mess, some too small for a child Tara's age. At the back of the van, a thin mattress lay pressed against the wall, covered by a tattered, dirty blanket. On it, a small child lay curled up. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she blinked against the sudden beam of light. She was extremely thin. Her hair had been unevenly chopped, and her arms bore faint bruises, likely the result of weeks or months of mishandling. She didn't cry or scream. When asked her name, she simply shook her head. She remained silent. Photographs taken during the recovery later showed the interior of the van exactly as it was found, dim, chaotic, and heartbreaking. On the floor, investigators collected several Polaroid cameras, exposed rolls of film, and a small duffel bag containing personal items from the suspects. Also inside were troubling pieces of evidence: children's underwear, rope, lotion bottles, and notebooks containing explicit sketches and disturbing drawings. It quickly became clear that the van hadn't just been used for sleeping. It had served as a mobile space of captivity, a place where abuse, isolation, and control had taken place for months. Within minutes of rescuing the child, officers expanded their search. Scanning nearby parking areas and alleys, they located 2 adult males sleeping in a separate vehicle parked less than 50 yards away. Both were detained on the spot. The older man was identified as Luis Treefrog Johnson, age 33. The younger was Alex Cabarra, just 17. Johnson refused to answer any questions, instead demanding an attorney. Cabarra, in contrast, appeared nervous and overwhelmed. He told officers that Johnson had instructed him on everything and insisted he hadn't understood the full extent of what was happening. The young girl, still unidentified at the time, was taken immediately to the Children's Home Society shelter in San Francisco. Paramedics assessed her on the scene. She was dehydrated and malnourished, but medically stable. Her physical injuries were minimal, but her behavior spoke volumes. She didn't speak during the ride to the shelter. When asked her name, her parents' names, or where she was from, she gave no response, only brief gestures or a quiet shake of the head. By early morning, authorities began the process of identification. Photographs and fingerprints were taken and transmitted via teletype to the Concord Police Department, where the Tara Burke case file was still active. At approximately 3 a.m., Sergeant Richard Gordy received the call. On the other end of the line, a San Francisco investigator carefully explained what they had found: a little girl rescued from a van, accompanied by 2 male suspects, one of whom matched a known offender. The officer listed off the child's description: her size, her hair, her lack of speech. As the details unfolded, Gordy immediately knew they were close. He requested the child's fingerprints be checked against those collected from Tara Burke's belongings during the initial investigation months earlier. 40 minutes later, the match was confirmed. Tara Burke had been found alive. When Gordy got the news, he didn't wait. Just after dawn, he drove to San Francisco himself. He carried with him the same photograph he had kept pinned to his office wall since February, a holiday portrait of Tara smiling in front of a Christmas tree, her hair long and golden. When he arrived at the Children's Home Society, the girl was sitting at a small table, wrapped in a blanket, quietly observing the nurses and staff as they moved around the room. Gordy approached, knelt down beside her, and gently placed the photo on the table in front of her. "Who is this?" he asked softly. The girl stared at the picture for a few seconds, then pointed to it. "That's me," she said, "and I want my long hair back." Those few words, simple, clear, and full of quiet strength, became the first undeniable confirmation of her identity. Medical evaluations later determined that Tara had likely been held in captivity for the full 10 months she was missing. During that time, she had been moved from place to place across San Francisco, hidden in alleys, parked behind buildings, and cut off from the outside world. Her captors had altered her appearance, cutting and dyeing her hair, and convincing her she had a different name. She had been told she was a boy. Her withdrawn behavior and limited speech reflected the deep emotional impact of her ordeal. Recovery would take time, but for Sergeant Gordy, that morning marked a turning point, the end of the longest unresolved child abduction case of his career. A search that began on a quiet suburban afternoon in Concord had ended in an industrial parking lot. In the shadows of old warehouses, inside a van that carried the weight of a child stolen months. That morning, both suspects, Luis Treefrog Johnson and Alex Cabarra, were booked into Kew, San Francisco County Jail. The initial charges included kidnapping, assault, and multiple counts of child endangerment. Additional charges were expected as investigators reviewed the disturbing contents found inside the van, including undeveloped film, photographs, and notebooks recovered at the scene. As word of the rescue quietly spread, officers carefully notified the Burke family under police supervision. They confirmed that the child was safe, in stable medical condition, and receiving proper care. Because of the sensitive nature of the case and the victim's condition, the department withheld public photos and statements until the next day. But for the first time in 10 long months, Tara's case file saw an update. The status line, which had read, "Missing, presumed abducted," was changed to a single word. "Recovered." In the days and weeks that followed Tara Burke's rescue, investigators from both Concord and San Francisco worked together to reconstruct the 10 months she had spent in captivity. The key source of information came from 11-year-old Mac, the brave boy whose escape had led officers to the van. His account, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence collected, formed the foundation of what would become the official timeline. According to Mac, the man who called himself Treefrog was actually Luis Johnson, 33 years old, a transient figure in San Francisco with no fixed address. He had lived on the streets for years, bouncing between rundown motels and his van, which doubled as both his home and a place where he exerted complete control over his surroundings. Johnson had a prior criminal record, including charges for indecent exposure and petty theft, and was described by those who had encountered him as deeply paranoid, manipulative, and obsessed with authority and dominance. His companion, Alex Cabarra, 17, had reportedly been under Johnson's control for most of his life. Records revealed that Cabarra had been groomed and abused by Johnson since he was just 9 years old. Raised in unstable environments and with no consistent adult guidance, he had come to rely entirely on Johnson, not only for shelter but for direction, even if that direction led to criminal acts. Through Mac's testimony, detectives began to piece together what had happened. On February 6, 1982, Johnson abducted Tara Burke from a parking lot in Concord. With Cabarra in the van, they drove straight into San Francisco, staying out of sight in industrial areas and shifting locations to avoid drawing attention. They parked in places where no one would question a rundown van, by the waterfront, behind warehouses, and under overpasses. Shortly after the abduction, Johnson altered Tara's appearance. He cut her hair short, dyed it darker, and insisted she no longer identify as a girl. He gave her a different name and forbade her to speak. She was kept inside the van, away from daylight, from fresh air, and from any sense of normal life. She was isolated, with only the 2 men for company. Neighbors in various neighborhoods later admitted to seeing the van parked for days at a time, but no one had imagined a child was hidden inside. By early summer, Johnson encountered Mac at a city bus stop. He offered the boy a small amount of money to help look after a kid. Thinking it was a short-term job, Mack agreed. But once inside the van, Johnson took his clothes, restricted his food, and refused to let him leave. According to Mack, life inside the van followed a strict, disturbing routine. Meals were irregular. Lights came on at odd hours. Orders were barked with no warning. Punishments came swiftly for speaking out of turn or moving without permission. Johnson referred to himself as the father and called the van our home. Mack described how Johnson frequently filmed and photographed both children using Polaroid cameras and a small video recorder. He said the older man stored the images under the mattress, hiding them in boxes and zippered bags. When police later examined the contents of the van, their worst fears were confirmed. Hundreds of photographs were discovered, many featuring Johnson and the two children, though exact details were not shared publicly. Investigators said the images clearly documented a prolonged pattern of abuse, coercion, and psychological manipulation. The film, cameras, notebooks, and other items seized during the raid provided undeniable evidence of the crimes. Kabara, Johnson's teen accomplice, appeared in many of the photographs. During questioning, he admitted to participating in several acts, but insisted Johnson was the one in control. He claimed he only obeyed out of fear and habit. Investigators concluded that Kabara had been deeply dependent on Johnson for years. Though he was technically still a minor at the time of Tara's abduction, the nature of his involvement and his age led prosecutors to charge him as an adult. Mack's story continued with the night of his escape. On December 17, 1982, Johnson passed out after drinking heavily. Seizing his chance, Mack climbed toward the small ceiling vent of the van. Pushing through the tight space, he squeezed through the opening and jumped down to the pavement. Dressed in oversized clothes and barefoot, he walked several blocks before finding a man he recognized from the neighborhood. He asked him to take him to the nearest police station. That brave decision, and Mack's willingness to speak, led directly to the events that unfolded the next morning. For the detectives involved, the interior of the van told the rest of the story. Boxes of undeveloped film, bags of children's clothing, and handwritten notebooks filled the space. The journals, written in Johnson's own handwriting, contained disturbing entries, obsessive references to family, obedience, and purity. Medical examinations of both Tara and Mack supported their statements. They showed signs of long-term neglect, malnourishment, and psychological trauma. For Tara especially, the months in isolation had taken a deep toll. When Sergeant Richard Gordy from Concord arrived at the impound lot to personally inspect the van, he was fully briefed on the inventory of what had been found. But no report could have prepared him for what he saw. Garbage littered the floor. The air was thick with the smell of mold, decay, and something else, something hard to describe but impossible to forget. The windows were blacked out with blankets. The walls were lined with makeshift coverings. And yet, even with the evidence removed, the weight of what had happened there hung in the air. Gordy later spoke to reporters about the experience. "I've seen crime scenes before," he said, "but that van, that place, it stuck with me. A part of me didn't come back out." For nearly a year, they had searched for Tara Burke without knowing if she was even alive. Now they knew. And what they uncovered was only the beginning. Following their arrest, Louise Johnson and Alex Kabara were formally transferred to San Francisco County Jail. The charges were severe, including kidnapping, multiple counts of child abuse, and sexual assault. As investigators processed the photographic and video evidence seized from the van, additional charges were filed relating to the creation and possession of illicit materials. Due to the cross-jurisdictional nature of the case, with the abduction originating. In Concord, the trial was moved to Contra Costa County to consolidate prosecution. Meanwhile, Mac, the 11-year-old boy whose escape had led to Tara's rescue, was placed in protective custody. He received both medical care and psychological support, beginning the long process of recovery from his own trauma. His willingness to speak up provided investigators with a detailed timeline of Tara's captivity, nearly day by day. With his help, police were able to locate specific parking spots, alleys, and abandoned buildings where the van had been kept, leading to the recovery of receipts, camera footage, and several witness confirmations. Even logs from nearby businesses confirmed the van's presence at key locations. In early 1983, the California Department of Justice compiled a comprehensive report summarizing the investigation. It described Louise Johnson as a transient individual with documented delusional behavior, a history of petty crimes, and a consistent pattern of predatory control. Cabarra, while legally still a minor at the time, was identified as a manipulated and psychologically dependent accomplice, someone whose actions directly contributed to the abuse and confinement of both victims, yet whose life had also been shaped by long-term coercion. The report confirmed what many had feared, that Tara Burke had been held against her will from February to December 1982. During those 10 months, she had endured psychological abuse, manipulation, and near-complete isolation. She had been denied contact with the outside world, her identity altered, and her speech suppressed. The report credited her survival and ultimately her rescue to the bravery of another child who refused to remain silent. By the time the case went to trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors had more than 400 Polaroid photographs, several videotapes, witness testimony from Mac, and detailed psychological and medical evaluations of Tara. The sheer volume of material and the disturbing clarity of what had occurred left no doubt about the crimes committed. But for those who had worked on the case, the significance of the trial extended beyond the courtroom. The horrors uncovered inside the van, the drawings, the writings, the photographs, had transformed a missing child case into something far deeper and darker. It was no longer about whether a child had been taken. It was about what had been endured and what it took to survive it. In the spring of 1983, Louise Tree Frog Johnson, age 33, was convicted on all major counts: kidnapping, child abuse, unlawful confinement, production of obscene material, and sexual assault. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning a verdict. He was sentenced to 527 years in state prison, a sentence designed to ensure he would never be released. He was transferred to Tehachapi State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Alex Cabarra, age 17, was tried separately. His defense portrayed him as both a participant and a victim, a boy who had grown up under Johnson's control, indoctrinated and emotionally manipulated. The jury acknowledged his long history of abuse but rejected his plea of insanity. He was found guilty on multiple charges and sentenced to 208 years in prison. Years later, after legal appeals and reviews, Cabarra's sentence was reduced to 25 years. He served quietly and was released on parole in 1995. He has not spoken publicly since. For the investigators, the verdicts brought legal closure, but emotionally, the case left a permanent mark. The details that emerged during trial testimony were difficult to process, and for many involved, the images from the van remained burned into memory. For Sergeant Richard Dick Gordy, the transition from searching for a missing girl to uncovering the truth of what she had lived through was particularly heavy. In a later interview, he reflected, "Finding her should have been the end. But once we saw what she'd been through, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, barely. Tara's recovery took time and was approached with care. After her rescue, she spent several months receiving care from child psychologists and trauma specialists. Because of her young age and the nature of her captivity, she recalled only fragments of the experience. Doctors chose not to push for memory recovery. Their goal was to rebuild her world, not revisit what had been stolen. To protect her identity and give her a chance at normalcy, Tara was quietly re-enrolled in school under her mother's maiden name. Her past was known only to school staff and close family members. She lived out of the spotlight, away from media attention. The California Victims of Violent Crime program covered her therapy sessions, which focused on building trust, reclaiming her sense of safety, and helping her move forward at her own pace. Throughout the years that followed, Gordy remained close. What had started as a duty, a detective assigned to a missing child case, became something deeper. He visited on birthdays and holidays. He helped her apply for educational support and assisted her mother with navigating state resources. When Tara entered her teenage years, it was Gordy who arranged tutoring and quietly encouraged her to consider college. In the mid-1990s, she enrolled at San Jose State University, majoring in child development. She moved into a dorm room, small, clean, and her own. The walls were decorated with sketches of butterflies, hand-drawn and colorful. When a counselor once asked her why butterflies, Tara simply said, "They mean freedom, because they don't live in cages." Her therapist described her as practical, resilient, and strikingly unbitter. She often avoided the word victim. Instead, she used another, lucky. Over time, Tara began to speak publicly, not frequently, but when asked, especially in support of other survivors. In one interview, she said, "People tell me to forget, but forgetting doesn't help. Remembering means you live through it." By then, Gordy had been promoted to lieutenant, but he never stepped away from her life. Through the Concord Police Association, he helped raise money for her tuition, transportation, and living expenses. To this day, he keeps the same photograph of Tara, the one taken before her abduction, pinned above his desk. His colleagues used to joke that Sergeant Gordy had adopted her. In many ways, he had. Over time, that bond grew from something official into something deeply personal, one built on quiet gestures, long conversations, and unwavering support. Tara herself acknowledged it in a handwritten letter during her freshman year of college. It read, "You gave me a new life and a brand new dad. Thank you for never giving up on me." On some weekends, Tara would visit Gordy and his longtime partner, Laura Stick, at their home in Martinez. She'd help Lavra bake cookies in the kitchen or sit outside with Laura's young daughter, Brittany, reading picture books and playing simple games. It was a home filled with warmth, laughter over dinner, weekend traditions, and kindness without expectation. For Tara, who had grown up between fractured homes and long, painful silences, it was a rare glimpse of stability, a version of family she'd never experienced before. With time, the visible signs of her past began to fade. Her court records were sealed, her medical history redacted to protect her privacy. She learned to move through the world again, not as a case number or a headline, but as a young woman reclaiming her future. The only physical reminder was a small scar on her arm, the result of a childhood fall long before the abduction. It was proof that she had a life before the van, before the silence, before the darkness. 15 years after her rescue, a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle reached out for a follow-up story. By then, Tara was 18, living on campus, and steadily building her own life. During the interview, she spoke calmly, not about trauma, but about recovery, and the quiet strength it took to keep going. When asked about Gordy, she smiled. "He doesn't like the word dad," she said. "But that's what he is." For Gordy, the case never truly left him. Even after retirement, the files remained in his office, yellowed, dog-eared, but always within reach. Every now and then, he would take out the same photograph he had carried in his shirt pocket during those 10 months of searching. The one of Tara in a Christmas sweater, smiling under a lit tree, her hair bright and golden dot in later interviews. When asked about the case, Gordy would often pause before speaking. "It's strange," he once said. "When you're a cop, you expect closure to come when you catch the bad guy. But real closure, that came when she walked into the room again, alive. That's when I knew we hadn't just solved a case. We had saved a life." That realization followed him through his final years in uniform and into retirement. He didn't often speak about the van, or the photos, or the files sealed in evidence lockers. Those belonged to another world one. He didn't revisit. What stayed with him instead was the memory that replaced all the others. A college student, seated at a table, her hair long again, laughing over a textbook. Free, years later. After attending a charity event for missing children, Gordy was spotted standing alone in the parking lot, quietly holding that same photograph. A reporter nearby happened to overhear him speak, not to anyone else, just to himself. "We found her," he said. "She made it." The words weren't loud. They weren't triumphant. They were steady, a quiet statement of fact and of faith. For Tara Burke, the little girl who vanished and found her way back, and for Sergeant Richard Gordy, the man who never stopped searching, that was enough. Her story is one of survival, but also of something deeper, the strength of human connection, and the power of someone believing in you even when you're lost. Tara's journey reminds us that even in the darkest investigations, light can still break through. And that sometimes, the real victory doesn't come in a courtroom. It comes in the quiet, rebuilding of a life once thought lost. For more true stories of courage, survival, and justice, don't forget to subscribe. Join us as we continue to uncover what really happened and the people who refuse to give up.